We did it, America! Super low unemployment, record high GDP, and a record high stock market, baby! For corporations, billionaires, and fascists everywhere, the US economy has never been stronger. Woo! Now let's see how things are going for everyday Americans.
It's getting harder to find work in the United States. In August, businesses added just 22,000 new jobs.
Okay, so if you're a recent college graduate, finding a job could be a little bit tougher than maybe you thought. A new report that came out this month is showing college grads they're facing one of the toughest job markets in a very long time. In fact,
we are following major economic news. New numbers suggesting the U.S. labor market is not as strong as it has appeared to be.
The U.S. economy added a modest 50,000 jobs last month. That was below expectations and capped the weakest year for job growth since the pandemic.
So, yeah. The American economy is doing horribly right now, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the rise of underemployed workers. People who could be working full-time jobs, but because of personal reasons or a lack of opportunities locally, are basically stuck doing part-time or gig work that doesn't pay enough for them to survive on their own. Or so you would think. Believe it or not, that's not actually how the Bureau of Labor Statistics defines underemployment. Let's say that we have a healthy 25-year-old college graduate. He's not a layoff victim and he's not disabled, but let's say that he only works 15 hours every week driving for DoorDash and that he lives in his mother's basement, doesn't pay any bills, and spends 65 hours every week playing Call of Duty. If you went on a date with this guy, you would think, yeah, he is hella underemployed for a healthy 25-year-old male. But in the eyes of Uncle Sam, he is a perfectly productive member of the part-time labor force and does not get counted in under or unemployment statistics. And that is causing a serious disconnect between how news outlets and government agencies talk about the American economy and what it is that we are actually seeing on the ground as Americans. Every year, there is a growing number of people who should be working full-time and paying their own bills, but aren't. Young men especially have been dropping out of both school and the workforce at an alarming rate. But this isn't just a social or psychological issue with men. In fact, over the past year, women outpaced men in the rate at which they're becoming discouraged workers. So this goes beyond a simple demographic issue like the propaganda machine would have us believe, and once again becomes an economics problem. The amount of families experiencing financial strain because their loved ones don't make enough money is only getting worse every year. See, Reaganomics basically made it so that productivity gains in American businesses would go into CEOs' pockets as opposed to being reinvested back into wages like they had been before, meaning that ever since 1979, our GDP growth has outpaced wage growth, causing consumer inflation to increase faster than regular workers are able to keep up with within the job market. And while I know that we're being a little overly simplistic here, the truth we can't ignore is that parents are having to increasingly cover that gap for their children. In fact, nearly half of American adults are being financially supported in some way, with the bank of mom and dad now shelling out $1,474 a month on average to their kids. So what this tells us is that politicians, corporations, and investors are actively ignoring the underemployment crisis that we're facing here in the US. Because so long as numbers continue to go up, then they can continue to ride the stock market gravy train. But even though that sounds comically evil out loud, it's not necessarily their fault. Investors rely heavily on official government reports in order to choose how much money to throw into the stock market. So if a major economic problem, like let's say half of American adults not being financially independent from their parents, gets conveniently ignored in the data, then investors get to look at that sweet 4.4% official unemployment rate and start shoveling money into the stock market, causing GDP and shareholder returns to grow despite Americans actively getting poorer. In fact, BLS numbers are such a big deal for GDP that the president decided to run a smear campaign against his own administration's data last year, because that felt politically safer than acknowledging the nation's underemployment crisis. So let's talk about that government data. The official unemployment rate in the United States comes from something called the U3 measure of unemployment published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which takes the amount of officially unemployed people divided by the total labor force times 100. Now, the reason why we don't base this off the entire US population is because that would include people like children, retirees, and stay-at-home parents, which would make the unemployment rate closer to 40% and just isn't a useful number, so that part's totally okay. But you'll notice that the U3 measure of unemployment only includes people who are officially unemployed, and that wording matters, because the official unemployment rate in the US only includes people who lost their job within the past 4 weeks, who are actively looking for work, and who are not making any money on the side. So if you got laid off from a 6-figure tech job and then immediately started running DoorDash the next day, then you are not considered unemployed. Instead, you are labeled as part-time for economic reasons. If you lose your job and it takes you more than 4 weeks to find a new one, then you don't count as unemployed either. Instead, you are labeled as marginally attached. And if you lose your job and then eventually give up on applying because there's not sufficient work in your area or you simply aren't qualified for it, then you no longer count as being unemployed either. Instead, you get labeled as discouraged. So when you see articles about how there's a crisis of young men dropping out of the workforce despite the unemployment rate not going up, that is why. Because marginally attached and discouraged workers are not counted in the official unemployment rate. They are instead listed in the U6 measure of unemployment, and that is the group that the federal government labels as the underemployed. And in my opinion, as somebody who spent 8 years researching, consulting, and teaching about the job market, that is a problem, because it defines underemployment as someone who has just been unemployed for a long time, as opposed to defining underemployment as someone who is not making enough money to pay their bills and be financially independent. And so even though this is technically just a semantics issue, the BLS defines the problem in the most economically destructive way possible, because our definition is so misleading that it is damn near useless. And here's why. The U6 measure of unemployment, which again is who the government considers the underemployed, is sitting between 8 and 9%. But if you combine that number with the amount of people who don't make enough money or aren't given enough hours to pay their bills, then that rate jumps up to approximately 25% of the labor force, 1 in 4 people. And that is a terrifying number. But it's also a number that probably aligns with what you and everyone else in America is seeing happen here on the ground. Here in Utah, we're seeing tons of former stay-at-home moms take on part-time jobs because their husband's salary hasn't increased enough in 6 years to match rent, groceries, and everything else. So families are now poorer. And across America, we're seeing people push back their retirements indefinitely because their retirement accounts don't align with the cost of living, again because of rampant inflation. And like I said earlier, we are watching millions of young adults become completely unable to financially sever from their parents, which isn't an inherently bad thing per se. Honestly, the US could stand to embrace multi-generationalism a little more, but because we are already such an individualistic culture, living with mom and dad in your 20s makes it nearly impossible to date, get married, have kids, and really live your own life. But young adults are trapped because the salaries for entry-level professionals don't match the cost of living. So what can be done about this? Well, the first and most uncomfortable truth that Americans need to accept is that Republican economics simply don't work. If minimum and entry-level wages continue to stay flat, like they have been for 17 years, and if inflation continues to grow at the same rate it has been since COVID, then we are only 26 years away from wages in the United States becoming the same as wages in India. So for starters, the US requires a significant increase in the minimum wage in order to help restore the purchasing power that our parents had, honestly closer to something like $25 an hour or $52,000 a year. And I know some people will hear that and think, hey, wait a minute, I have a master's degree and I don't even make $52K at my job. If that became the minimum wage, then why wouldn't I just quit to work a less stressful job that pays more money? And to that, I would say, exactly. That is literally how worker leverage and business incentives are supposed to work. And that was how things worked back during the golden age of the American economy. But that leverage has been taken away from us by 50 years of fiscally conservative policies. Policies that actively harm working class Americans while enriching and protecting some of the most evil people in recent history. A big reason why white-collar and technical workers don't get meaningful raises anymore is because your boss knows that you already make twice as much money as the person working at Wendy's down the street. So if you were to quit this job for not getting a raise, then they know that you can't find anything that pays better locally. But if the people working at Wendy's all of a sudden started making similar salaries to, let's say, GIS technicians, then what do you know? The money for raises magically appears, because companies are currently only devoting 15% of their gross revenue to pay for workers in 2026. Now, admittedly, out of economic ignorance, people will argue that a mass increase in wages would also make everything more expensive, and it's not really your fault if you believe that. But let me rip the band-aid right off and let you know that this has been proven false 1,000 times over by economists, academics, think tanks, and even by states themselves that have forcibly increased wages. Ever since the Reagan administration and the invention of modern Republican economics, wages have become detached from productivity, and the price of goods is no longer based on a supply and demand model, at least not at the local level. So, for example, the last time the minimum wage was increased, the Taco Bell Crunchwrap Supreme cost $2. 17 years later, the Crunchwrap Supreme now costs over $7, despite the fact that workers at those Taco Bells in mostly red states are making the exact same amount of money, meaning that it is now 3 times more expensive for people doing the exact same amount of labor to eat at the place where they work, compared to 17 years ago. That is Republican economics for you, and that is why it costs 3 times as much money to live in America today as it did back in the 70s, because this same phenomenon has played out across everything from housing to cars to college tuition. But that's not even the only way that Americans are getting screwed, because wage stagnation over time allows companies to double dip on our taxes. Every year, taxpayers pay companies anywhere from $100 to $200 billion in corporate subsidies. And every year, taxpayers also pay $1.1 trillion on welfare programs for things like SNAP and Section 8 housing, which mostly covers the fact that wages don't align with cost of living. And not only that, but companies get tax breaks when they hire people who are on those same welfare benefits. So they are literally double, if not triple dipping on US taxpayers. Companies don't pay enough, so taxpayers cover that with welfare programs. And then companies are given subsidies and tax breaks when they hire people who are on welfare. So they continue to not pay enough because taxpayers literally subsidize the fact that they don't pay enough, and arguably downright reward companies for creating even more people who live in poverty and have to utilize welfare programs. That is honest to God how things work in the United States of America. If you as a worker are not getting paid enough money to live where you live, then your taxes are subsidizing the fact that your your employer does not pay you enough money. And when it comes to the broader job market, things go even deeper and darker than that. So if you'd like to dive into how all of these corporate incentives are actively killing the online job market, then consider watching this video next, where we break down exactly why underemployed people are having such a hard time landing better paying jobs. I will see you over there.